In the next section of your book, section 3.2, the author talks about the specifics of water chemistry. So we start out by looking at just what is the importance of the global supply of water to us. Now we know that water is critical to continued life, but when we look at the global supply that we have, on the left you'll see figures for the year 2000 where the estimated total population was 6 billion people, and it's broken up into water availability. So what percentage of the world has relatively sufficient water? 90% of the world's population, 6 billion people in the year 2000, had access to clean water. Another 6% had a water supply which was stressed. They had access, but there was a lot of strain on that system. And then 4% for which it was scarce. Now, from that point, if we look at projections, okay, and this is a projection for the year 2025, and this is just a medium projection. This isn't an extreme scenario, just kind of middle of the road projection. Projecting the population by then will approach almost 8 billion. Now look at the change in the numbers, only 62%. So we've dropped almost 30% in the population that had sufficient water. The amount that has a stressed water system, 27%, and then those who have a lack of water goes up to 11%. So in all, almost 40% of the population is going to have a water issue. And now this projection is a few years old, so newer projections are saying we may actually reach this stage before 2025. It may be worse than that if something isn't done to moderate that. So we know that, keeping the global supply of water clean, keeping an eye on it is very important. Now, what is it exactly we're keeping an eye on? Well, we're keeping an eye on biological species in the water and chemical species, and that's what we're going to focus on here. So what are the chemicals, the chemical species that we want to keep an eye on in the water? Well, if we look at the next figure, it just shows the stratification, if you will, of a lake in the summer, kind of where the chemical species are going to be found. The upper layer tends to be the warmer water that has aerobic conditions, oxygen. So notice all of the compounds in this upper level contain oxygen. So we have carbon dioxide, we have sulfate, nitrate, we have iron hydroxide, we've got carbonic acid, which remember is essentially water and carbon dioxide gas. Okay, so those two are very closely related. And then also bicarbonate ion, hydrogen carbonate, so that relates as well to these two, right? And then you've got your anaerobic conditions, your colder water down here. Notice there's no oxygen down at the bottom. We have things like methane, ammonium ion, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, okay, so very closely related there. And then ferrous iron, so iron in the 2+ oxidation state. And that will be a little bit different. In general, we can divide these into reactions that are controlled by pH, acid-base reactions, and we can look at ones that are controlled by redox, so oxidation reduction. Those two things are very important. Typically what you'll see is that acid-base or pH-controlled reactions, I'm off screen there a little bit, sorry, are the ones that control the inorganics. Okay, so when we're talking about acids, bases, and pH, we're looking at inorganic species. And if we are looking at redox reactions, I don't know why my pen is not reacting well here. Redox tends to control the organic species. Okay, so if you can read that, my goodness. Okay, so organic species controlled through oxidation reduction reactions, inorganic chemical species through acid-base. We want to keep that in mind as we're going through these. All right, so in these figures, the author is demonstrating some of the different equilibrium systems that we have to be concerned about in our water chemistry. When we're talking about equilibrium, remember from Gen Chem, when you see that double-headed arrow. So that double-headed arrow indicates that we have an equilibrium, that the forward and reverse reactions can both be occurring. And some of the chemical species that we're interested in water include the equilibrium system shown in the upper left corner. That includes carbonic acid. So remember, carbon dioxide and water together are the same thing as H2CO3, carbonic acid. We have this species here, which I believe he meant to put as HCO3 minus. We don't have just CO3 minus in solution. And then we have, so hydrogen carbonate and then carbonate down here. And all three of these will be in equilibrium. Now notice that the concentration of any of those species at any given time, shown here on the y-axis, is controlled by the pH. So we can determine what species should be present in water by measuring the pH. That's one of the reasons pH is an important measurement of water, because it shows us, what chemical species we can expect at any given point. We can also use that to kind of control what species are in solution for things like drinking water or whatnot. Another system that is shown in the upper right corner is that of here, this is sort of the same thing as sulfurous acid, H2SO3. It is really SO2 and H2O in water. We've got hydrogen sulfite here, and we've got our sulfite ion. We also have in the lower left corner the ammonium ammonia, and you can see here that it is an equilibrium, but that ammonia as a species is a very small amount on this equilibrium for the ranges of pH that we're looking at. So mostly what we're looking at is ammonium in our water, but still both species are present. Both can be very important when we're looking at this pH range, which is typical for a lot of waters. And then we have over here hydrogen sulfate and sulfate ion in equilibrium with one another. So just some equilibrium systems that we want to keep in mind, keep an eye on as opposed to ion, sorry, no pun intended, as we're looking at these. And just as a reminder, just some things to keep in mind as you're looking at these. Now, these are from another environmental chemistry book, but it's just a good example of different states that a couple of these different compounds can be in. And we're going to focus on sulfur and nitrogen here just because we get a lot of sulfur oxide. So I'm going to put an X to indicate it could be 3, could be 4, and nitrogen compounds, NO2, NO3, and the ammonium that we've got. So it's good to know those oxidation states. So we want to focus these things, what we call SOx and NOx. SOx and NOx are very important in water chemistry because they contribute to acid rain. Ammonia and ammonium contribute to issues in water as well. So we can see that as we increase levels of oxidation for both of these, for sulfur oxidation and nitrogen oxidation, we get different species, and the different species will either be in the form of aqueous solution, they'll be dissolved in the water, or as a salt in the water, or you may get them in the gas phase or occasionally a molecular solid here. Okay, so aqueous solution and salts, and then gas phase for the nitrogen. So just some things that may help to explain when you're looking at water at any particular point, what you've got going on in that water. In this section, in 3.2, the author talks specifically about carbonates in water. So the figure that you have on the left just shows carbonate species by themselves in rainwater. So it's that same equilibrium we were looking at. Hydrogen carbonate, carbonate, and carbonic acid. Again, this is has an asterisk because it's a reminder that we really have this. Not a 3, a 2. CO2, H2O CO2. And what we're showing here is sort of the relationship of that equilibrium system, looking at it in a different way and combining it with, pH really is in here, so hydronium ion concentration. Take that into account so we can see how these species interact with one another. Now, another reason that we want to keep an eye on carbonates is because very often, not always, but very often, and especially in our area, calcium comes into play. So when you have an area like we have that's a karst topography that has limestone, you get a lot of calcium in there. And so calcium occurs, as calcium carbonate, CaCO3, known as limestone, calcite, a lot of different names for that. As that dissolves, that introduces calcium ions into the system. Now, in the author's figure, he talks about the equilibrium of calcium with hydrogen carbonate in rivers. You can also look at this in lakes and streams, but this is in a moving body of water. And what he is trying to point out in this one is that the nature of the river and the amount of calcium affects the equilibrium that you have going on. When you have something such as the rivers that you're seeing over here, so Amazon, Orinoco, Parana, Niger River, all of those, notice that, first of all, here's our equilibrium line, where we have calcium ions in equilibrium with the hydrogen carbonate. We get a 1-to-1 balance where the calcium's binding to the hydrogen carbonate. And so that's represented by this gray line that they've got going right here. I won't draw it all the way up, but that gray line represents that equilibrium under standard conditions. Now, when you have rivers that are low salt, low calcium, so they are unsaturated or undersaturated with respect to calcium or calcium carbonate, notice that the equilibrium is shifted off the line and they're all to the left of that line. Okay, so it's a change in the equilibrium, the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide in the water based on the calcium. The calcium's sort of upsetting the balance a little for the system that we had over here. Okay, but now when you have that calcium present, okay, so you see kind of right in here, we see a lot of these rivers that are falling on that line, and notice they're kind of between this area. So when we're below this light blue line right here, we're looking at low salt. When we're looking kind of between these two lines, we're looking at systems that are essentially kind of in balance with that calcium. Now notice what happens when we kind of start going above that line. We get between the next set of blue lines. Now we're getting a little bit of a shift to the right. And so those rivers tend to be saturated in calcium carbonate, and so their partial pressure of carbon dioxide in equilibrium with the calcium is higher than it would be in the atmosphere. Okay, so those are things like, actually the Rhine is a little bit off there, the Danube, it's a little hard to tell, is a little off, the Rio Grande, most definitely the Don River. Those are all kind of shifted up and over that way. And the effect of that, it's just telling you something about the base that they're on, so how much calcium they have available. So these are going to be the low calcium over here. These are going to be, the high calcium over here on this side. Here's another way to look at that carbonate equilibrium that might make a little more sense. So we can see what species are present in any particular given spot in your lake, stream, river, water. So in air, that's where we have our gaseous carbon dioxide, which can exchange. Okay, so it's constantly exchanging in the water. So carbon dioxide is dissolving in water to form this carbonic acid, CO2 plus H2O. And also that carbon dioxide can outgas from the water and return to the atmosphere. So this is a cycle that's going on here, back and forth. All right, but once we get that carbonic acid dissolved in the water, that can also enter an equilibrium where it deprotonates. So we get one proton, one acid proton coming off, and we get our hydrogen carbonate. All right. excuse me. Now, if we go down to the bottom and we look at our substrata, rock, soil, sediments, anything that we have that contains calcium. So if we have calcium carbonate present, that can be dissolved into the water and put calcium ions into the water, as well as carbonate ions. So we're just breaking this one up into calcium 2+ and carbonate 2- ions, okay? So now these ions are present. The calcium ions more or less stay dissolved in the water. They can react with things. They can precipitate out depending on what's there. So thus, reverse reaction, it can reprecipitate or it can precipitate with something else. But it can also, the carbonate can react with water. And now we get a hydroxide ion and a bicarbonate ion. So now if we take the hydrogen and the hydroxide from each of those separate reactions, they're going to react to form a water molecule. And then we end up with these two hydrogen carbonates, which actually is pretty handy because hydrogen carbonate is what we call an amphoteric species. Okay, amphoteric hydrogen carbonate. And that means that it can act as either an acid or a base. Notice that it is an anion, so it can accept an acidic proton, just like the one it gave up over here. But it is also, it still has a proton on there that could be donated as an acidic proton and then form another H+ and a CO3 2-. Okay, so it acts almost as a buffering system and it enters into the equilibrium that we were looking at. So very important to keep an eye on the carbonate equilibrium there. That actually helps to moderate and modulate a lot of things in our water. Now, if you want to break that down, you've got all these equilibriums here, but you can also break it down into a series of reactions. So here's just a list of reactions within that equilibrium system. So these are the reactions you're going to get for carbon dioxide, bicarbonate, and carbonate ions, including just the reaction that you saw with the H+ and the OH- to form water. If we look at those at any given point, and calcium's in here as well, so notice all your calcium species are in here. So here's all of those reactions. Now, the nice thing is, we know things about these reactions. We know what the equilibrium constants are for these at, room temperature at 25 degrees Celsius. We know solubility products and base. Okay, so KH, KB, we know all these different things that can allow us to actually make some measurements and make predictions about effects that are going to occur in this system. In the next section, the author just shows some equilibria for other elements that can be important in aqueous systems. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these, but just note 3.2.4 and 5 deal with aluminum. The reason he points those out is because aluminum is a fairly common metal to a lot of systems, particularly in Europe where the author is from, and aluminum also can have a toxicity to fish and other organisms in the water. So aluminum is one that is very often monitored. And then he also shows a couple of other plots for equilibria with nitrate and ammonium. So we looked at those a little bit already. It's different ways of looking at things. Depending on what it is you're measuring, you may need these other charts. So just showing how these are in equilibrium with one another. And he talks more about that. So as you read that section in the book, you'll see more about that. He also looks down here at the conversion of ammonium into nitrate ion, actually, in running water. So when you look at this one, this is basically how the concentration of nitrogen in any given form changes over distance within a water system. So this is the point of release down here of whatever material you're looking at. So if you have fertilizers or you have industrial runoff, those are things that are going to introduce ammonium or nitrates, nitrites. It's going to introduce those things to the water. And you can see that as you move downstream, okay, so this is distance in kilometers, after about 5 kilometers, if you look kind of at the ammonium tends to drop off, and then also the red line, the nitrite, that sort of peaks at about 5 kilometers. Those both drop off, and the nitrates start growing. Well, why is that when they start at 0? And the nitrite did as well. Well, this is the release of ammonium into the water, and then its subsequent conversion into these products. So it's being converted through oxidation. So what's happening is the ammonium ion is encountering oxygen in a variety of forms, a variety of different compounds. It can be introduced through pure oxygen in the air. It can be introduced through some of the SOx or even some NOx that's already there. There's oxygen from a source. It starts converting that ammonium, and so you end up getting a lot of nitrates in the water, which again, the nitrates can be a little bit of a problem, but nitrite especially and ammonium have a toxicity to fish. So especially in the range that we're in up here, from about 0 to 5 or 10 kilometers downstream of that ammonia release, you have an issue for your wildlife species with that buildup. Now in this plot, the author is looking at another PE-pH diagram. We looked at those a little bit in the last section. And he's looking at this for iron species because iron is present in almost all water systems. It's just a very common ion, very common element to find. Almost every rock you see has iron in some form in it. And iron can be oxidized. So we go through different species. So we've got it in the ferrous state, Fe2+, we've got it in the ferric state, Fe3+, we've got it as a complex ion with hydroxide, we have it as a solid amorphous iron hydroxide that can be in there, we can have iron carbonates. So we see in metallic iron, we've got all these different forms that again, depending on the pH and the electropotential activity that we have going on here, we are going to have various species in water. Now, some of these can be problematic. So, for example, the ferric iron, the Fe3+, can give a metallic taste to your water that's very unpleasant. It has almost a blood-like taste because that's the form of iron in our blood. Parts as low as 0.3 of a part per million, so 0.03 parts per million can be detected and give an off taste to your water. So you want to keep an eye on the amount of iron that you have in your water. Also, the iron oxides that you get, so the various forms that you have with oxygen in them, and also just Fe2O3, can give a cloudiness. So this amorphous iron hydroxide and other forms will make water look cloudy and unpleasant. So iron is one of the things that is very frequently monitored in water quality. Chlorine species are monitored in water, partially because there are natural sources of chlorine, but mostly because this is what has traditionally been used for disinfection purposes in our water. Now, not every municipal system uses chlorine anymore, and that is one thing I would encourage you to try to find out more about. Whatever your municipal water system is, if you're on a municipal water system, do a little digging around and see if you can find out what sort of disinfection system they use. Do they still use chlorine, or are they using something like ozone or reverse osmosis, something to that effect? Now, chlorine again enters into an equilibrium, and it's here at the top. So chlorine gas and water will combine to form hypochlorous acid, okay, right here. And then we've got acidic protons, we've got chloride ions, and we also, this will break apart. Here's another side reaction. We get a proton and we get hypochlorite ions, OCl, which if you're not familiar with hypochlorite, you may be more familiar with this one in this form as the sodium hypochlorite. If you don't know what that is, go get your bottle of bleach and look on the label and you will see that on there. So that's what bleach is. It's sodium hypochlorite, so it breaks apart again into its ions. And the hypochlorite is the one that has the bleaching action that we have here. Now, if we look at the diagrams that are here, it's concentration versus PE for these, for the chlorine species. So we're not looking at pH, except for right here. So there are 3 plots, and these are all the equilibria that we have for a given pH. All right, so the first one to the left shows the equilibria for the various species when the pH is 2, very, very low, acidic. Now, that's not a typical condition for a lake, a stream, drinking water, anything like that, but we can see that the hypochlorite tends to be fairly low. Here's our chlorine gas. Here's our hypochlorous acid. Here's our chloride ions. Now, what's going to have the best disinfecting action is actually going to be the hypochlorous acid and the chlorine ion to some extent. So the chlorine gas dissolved in there kind of stays in equilibrium with those. Hypochlorite that used for bleach, we know it can have a disinfecting action. That's what we use it for. We use it for cleaning. But it actually is quite a bit slower at killing these various organisms than the other species that we have, than the hypochlorous acid, the chloride ions, so on and so forth. It has a harder time penetrating the cells of these organisms. So even though it will have a disinfecting action, it probably won't be around long enough to do the job completely. So, you know, this isn't something we want to have in the highest quantities. We want to keep this one. All right, now if we go to pH 5, we can see that the chloride and the hypochlorous acid aren't really affected so much, but notice now that our hypochlorite ion, how much it's come up. So it's this line right here. Now compare it to that first plot. Notice how far up it's come in terms of concentration. Much higher concentration. Notice our chlorine that can have a disinfecting action as it dissolves in the water has dropped considerably. And now come over here to pH 8, which is probably pretty close to the water systems that we've got around here. Chlorine hasn't been terribly affected except for the potential. Now notice that, you know, chlorine's potential was dropping around 24, 25. Over here it was dropping around 23. Now it's down here at about 21. Okay, notice that our hypochlorous acid has both dropped in concentration and changed in potential. Look at this hypochlorite here, this purple one. It's way up here. So we have a species which can disinfect but takes its time about doing it, and then we've got our chlorine way down here. So that's not to say that chlorine isn't good. Obviously it is, and we use it for disinfection, but it just means that the higher the pH, the more chlorine we're going to have to use. So we have to add a lot more chlorine for disinfecting the water than we would have, you know, at a lower pH. And that's part of the reason why a lot of places have, let me go back a second, that's the reason a lot of places have gone to disinfectant methods other than chlorine, not only because depending on the pH and the other species in the water, they're required to add quite a bit of chlorine, but the other thing that isn't being shown here is that there are byproducts of chlorination. So what happens is this hypochlorite and other species are hanging around the water long enough to react, and they form what are known as trihalomethanes, THMs, or sometimes you'll see it as, you know, TTHM. Trihalomethanes are harmful byproducts in the water that you really don't want to be consuming, and so additional steps are required in order to keep those trihalomethanes at a low level in the water. And depending on the condition of the water, the biological activity, it may require so much chlorine that they can't keep the trihalomethanes under control. That's usually where you'll see a municipal system switch to something other than chlorine. And there are some very good alternatives to chlorine out there, actually. All right, in the next section, the author talks a little bit about all of these various chemical species in the environment. And again, I will not go into a huge amount of detail on these. You can read these in the book for yourself and look at these, but these are good to refer back to. So what you have in figure 3.2.10 is the cycle for these species in rainwater. So how do these species get into the rainwater in the first place, and then what eventually happens to them? So if we look at our atmosphere and what we have in here, through the reaction with energy in various forms from the sun or from lightning, we get all the species that you're seeing here. So you're getting things like sulfite, so sulfur dioxide, you're getting sulfuric acid, you're getting these NOxes that we talked about, you're getting ammonia, you're getting hydrochloric acid, you're introducing a variety of oxygen species to those, as well as, aerosols, dust, and water. All of these things are going to, and here's a list of sources of those, deposition and whatnot. All of those are going to react to give you acids, bases, particulate matter, and dust that's in the atmosphere. Those all enter into water, rainwater, to form all the variety of species you see here. And then again, you can look at these yourself, but these all get divested into various sources. So you can see that some of them enter into terrestrial or aquatic environments. Some of them get taken up by biomass, so by plants and animals. We get nitrification of some of them. We get denitrification, so oxidation and reduction going on there. We get a little more reduction down here. There's a whole dance that is going on in that rainwater. So take a closer look at that figure and the information in the book. That will all come into play in rainwater and then eventually into the lakes and streams and rivers that we look at. Now, one of the reasons monitoring your rainwater becomes very important is because we need to look at the effect that it has on us as human beings and the things that we rely on, such as animal species, plant species, so on and so forth. So in this figure, the author is showing the pathways for, remember we talked about SOx and NOx, well here those are right here, and we can see that through either deposition or oxidation, those get combined to form various acids. So we have nitric acid and sulfuric acid. Now those break down into various components in the rain, but the problem is they can be deposited either through acid rain or even dry deposition and then later incorporated into these species. And that eventually will lead to the acidification of material, of water, of soil, gets released, okay, or it causes the release of metals from soil where those are bound. All of these things then enter the biome. They enter into our lakes and streams and waterways, and that can acidify the water. Now, we don't see that much of a problem here in the Ozarks because we, as we've said, are on a karst topography. We have a large amount of limestone, calcium, to kind of modify that acid because we end up with a lot of bicarbonate and carbonate, which can easily take up acidic protons. So we don't tend to see highly acid conditions, but areas that don't have that, so for example, areas of the Northwest and the Northeast up in Canada, areas of Europe have these issues. And so their water can eventually start to acidify. Now, if we're looking, we're right up here, 7.5, maybe higher, 8, something like that. But most aquatic species are pretty good until you start getting down to about a 6.5. Okay, about 6.5. Notice the color starts to change a little. This is where we start to see some species having issues. Things like crabs, snails, mussels, various species of fish, various water insects, plankton, start to really have some trouble with that. As you keep going, you get down to about a 5.5. You've pretty much lost all these species up here. They're dead. And then we've added, various whitefish to that. Perch and pike start to have some trouble. By the time you get down, another pH unit, down to about 4.5, there's nothing that's surviving. It's all dead. So if you get down to a pH, even 5, in some places 5, pretty much nothing's going to be alive in there. So if you reach that level, you've got a dead lake, a dead stream, a dead river. Nothing's going to be around there. So we do need to keep an eye on these various species and chemical species now as opposed to animal species. And two of the biggest concerns, SOx and NOx. Where are SOx and NOx coming from? Well, they were in equilibrium until we started spitting a bunch of them out with our factories, our homes, our automobiles. So we've added a huge source of those to the environment that is now having this effect on our animal and plant species. And here's just a couple of pictures sort of illustrating these effects. It's not always really visible. The picture that you have here on the left is a fish kill in a Canadian lake. So in Canada, they didn't have a way to absorb this. The acid level of the lake got high enough that this entire species of fish just started dying out in the lake. They just started washing up on the shore in huge quantities. Over here on the right, you see this lovely Swedish lake, looks beautiful. There's not anything living in that water. It has acidified to the point, it's at a pH of around 4.5. And frankly, that's about the pH of coffee. So it would be like, animals trying to live in a cup of coffee. I'm not sure I would want to go swimming in that, but it's just completely devoid of aquatic life. It looks lovely, but it's completely sterile. So can have a huge effect. Now, we talked a little bit about the fact that these SOx and NOx can combine through dry deposition in the soil or through water deposition and create the release of metal ions. And there are other ways that metal ions are introduced into the ecosystem, but something that we do want to keep an eye on are the emission and transport of various trace metals. Now, this is for riverbeds, but it can hold for a lot of different things too, because these trace metals can create problems for us depending on those metals. So if you look at a water quality report, you'll notice that trace metals do get monitored in there just because of the issues some of them cause with our biological systems. So where are they coming from? Well, industrial use, various consumer applications. We are probably washing more ions down the drain than we know with our various products and things that we use. Fossil fuels, when we burn those, we are releasing several metals from those. Minor quantities for an individual, but taken in total, it's quite a bit of metal getting released. A lot of agricultural processes use these metals. Various metal salts are used for insecticides and herbicides and things like that. Advection into ponds, so things getting pulled into ponds through deposition and I can't think of the word I want right now, but runoff and various things. Okay, so where do they go from there? Well, from consumers and industry, direct entry hopefully into a treatment plant, so from homes or industry, goes to your sewage plant and hopefully is getting treated and either immobilized, but some may get through and end up in your surface water through river, lake, stream, whatever you're using. Fossil fuels, those get dispersed into the air where they hang out for a little while until they get either deposited or pulled out in the rain. They can end up on land, from irrigation purposes. Eventually those all end up down here as well. Ponds, it's already in the surface water, just ends up right here. So all of these metals from these various sources, they go through a variety of pathways, but they're all going to end up pretty much in the same place. So you want to keep an eye on the metals in the river to see the concentration going on. Now, this figure, 3.2.13, shows a little bit of the equilibrium of metals in various bodies of water. And we can look at, where they're coming from. So through precipitation, somewhere on land, we've got either solids, dissolved metals, bringing those into the system, and then we can see how those get incorporated. We do get some sedimentation. We do get some of them bound up in the soil, but they don't necessarily stay there. They end up cycling through. We can have a variety of ways. So if this is our metal that is dissolved in water, M for a generic metal in aqueous solution, It can either get adsorbed onto something or bound to another ion. So for example, hydroxides is a big way of tying up metal ions. They can precipitate out with something else. They can just be assimilated as a metal, so they can come out of solution in the metallic form. They can become methylated, so they can combine with hydrocarbons to form metallic hydrocarbons, or they can form complexes. Now, for most of these, those remain in the system and cycle through the system, but the one we worry about right here is the methylated compounds, because these then tend to get taken up by our aquatic species, like fish. They enter the food chain. So if you're not sure what, we talk about methylation, you're probably familiar with one in particular, methylated mercury. So when they talk about the mercury that's in tuna and other fish, it's not mercury in terms of the pure metal. You wouldn't take a fish and be able to open it up and find little droplets of metal mercury. It's methylated mercury that these fish are then getting, so that methylated mercury is getting taken up by the plankton and the other sources that the fish eat, and then it gets incorporated into the fish and then continues on into the rest of our food chain, to our biomass, i.e. us. So metals in water, big concern. None of these other sources are necessarily going to be a huge problem, but they stay in the system. But methylation is the one point at which we're keeping an eye on things. And then metals in lakes in particular, the author looks at. And again, won't go into a lot of detail on this. You can look to see the cycle of these. But you can see some of the ones that the author points out as being important to, again, European systems, still important to us here in the US. So iron and manganese are two that he really calls on and looks at how those combine with various other materials, phosphates and whatnot. All right, so you can take a look at that and read in the book, talking about the cycle of metal ions within a lake, a little bit different from in a moving body of water in a river. And the metals in lakes is something that in the next lab we meet, we'll take a look at a little bit. We'll take the water samples everyone's collected and do some measurements for various metal ions in that sample. And then the author finishes up with one more equilibrium system, looking at metal complexes in water. So this is something you'll probably want to take a look at before the next lab when we meet. It just shows the types of metal complexes, whether you'll have what he calls aqua metal ions, okay, so just metal ions dissolved in water, whether you'll have complex ions. Notice these are all hydroxo, they're all combined with hydroxide in this range, or if you have oxidated ions, so oxo complexes down here. Again, it's dependent upon pH, and in this case also the oxidation state of the metal. So the oxidation state will determine whether or not you can put it into a system or not. And this becomes interesting because you can actually move things around from one to the other based on the pH. So notice, for instance, I've got iron 3+ ion and I've got iron hydroxide. And depending on the pH, okay, and it's saying it can be a different oxidation state for that one. It could be 2+ or 3+ for the hydroxo complex. But say I'm looking at the 3+ state or even the 2+, I can go from an aqueous species to something that will precipitate out just by shifting the pH. So if I'm at a pH of around 4, 4.5, I may have this iron in solution and I want to get the iron out of my water. Well, if I just change my pH slightly and bring it up here to about a 6, I can create this complex which can be precipitated out of solution. So now I've removed the iron, the metallic taste, the unwanted effects of iron in my water just by adjusting it slightly. Once I separate that water from the unwanted compound, I can shift my pH back to where I want it to be. Or if I need to put an ion into solution, I can change the pH, put it in solution, and then again make some adjustments if I want to keep it in there but still have water in the range that's usable to us. So this is our usual pH range here for bodies of water, but just be aware that, we can play with those and move them around in there. So that's an overview of the water chemistry in a nutshell. In the next section, we'll take a look at some applications for that.